Dr. Susan Langley. Dr. Langley is the State Underwater Archeologist for the Maryland Historical Trust, directing the Maryland Maritime Archaeology Program within the Office of Preservation Services. She currently chairs and holds the archaeological research seat for the Monitor National Marine Sanctuaries Advisory Council and is co-chair of the Geographic Planning Work Group for Emergency Response Contingency Planning, which coordinates federal, state, regional, and local agencies. Dr. Langley has been an adjunct professor at several colleges and universities, including Johns Hopkins. She also taught marine archaeology in Thailand for the Southeast Asian Ministers of Education Organization. Dr. Langley is an active scuba instructor, lectures internationally on a broad range of subjects, including underwater archaeology, the culture of heritage lying beneath the waters of Chesapeake Bay, and the history of piracy. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Susan Langley.
I am standing up, honest. There we go. All right. I'm just a short person, so hope you can see me. I'm usually just my head sticks over the podium. It's like old home week coming to the Eastern Shore. I've been in Maryland for more than 20 years now. I've had the pleasure of working with Bill Wilson at Pemberton, with County Executive Bob Culver on the Menhaden boat outside his property, with, I'm trying to think of a large number of you for various projects. And I want to thank the Hurleys. I use your books all the time. They are invaluable. Thank you. I do teach history of piracy. I also have a second master's in textiles. My first one's in law. No one's interested in that. Textiles, yes. But when I teach history of piracy, one of the situations I run into is, of course, convincing my students what is and what is not piracy. There were constant references to pirating music and things. That's not piracy. That's just a media coolness. Piracy, unless it happens at sea and unless you're robbed, it's not piracy. Murder at sea is still murder. It's criminal activity. But if you're robbed at sea, it's piracy. And that's piracy probably arose about 10 minutes after someone figured out how to put something on a boat and float it somewhere. So maybe it's the second oldest profession. And I thank you very much. I have a volunteer because the remote they gave me didn't work and they couldn't get it to, so if you don't mind, please. Most people these days, especially my students, when you say piracy, this is kind of what they think of. Others, if you don't mind, will, where the Admiral went, please. There we go. That may be what you think of. I know that was one of my mother's favorites. But I don't know where the Admiral went. I want him to put his foot up on something for us. Yes, Captain Morgan became Admiral Morgan and also became the Lieutenant Governor of Jamaica. He's a little bit more cleaned up than he used to be. But as far as what we think of as piracy, Blackbeard, he never really came up this way that we know of. There are stories of Blackbeard perhaps being up the Chesapeake as far as Chestertown. It's possible, can't substantiate it. Was he in Chincoteague? I think that's a little more likely, and they say that. We do have Colonel Cropper and Accokeek complaining about the pirates holed up on Hog Island and some of the other barrier islands, so they were in the area. But these are the famous, the sexy pirates, the ones my students want to hear about. That's not who I tell them about. Real pirates probably were mostly like muggers. A lot of them, they were looking for, quick cash. They were small potatoes. They were after, hooch, money. The robberies were very small in these areas. They did exist. But big-time piracy never really made it up the bay because originally, early on, the 16th, 17th, 18th century, mostly 17th and 18th, there was nothing to rob. Nobody was up here. By the time, they were down in Virginia, but by the time we had enough people up here to make it worth their while, 18th, 19th century, we also had a better Navy. So we never had the piracy in the Northern Bay that we see early on. So I'll cover a little bit of the Virginia waters. I'm sorry, but we have to do that. And I will talk about some of the folks who did make it up our way, please. First thing you have to know about piracy is that peace makes piracy. We don't have pirates during wartime. Everybody's got a job. And you see, wartime was pretty much most of the time. However, when peacetime came, when peace broke out, as they say, the problem came that you have a lot of unemployed sailors who don't have any other marketable skills, and there was no unemployment insurance. If you were in the Navy as an officer, you might get half pay to tide you over, a little bit of a retainer. Nobody else did. So if we graphed it, every time a war ended, piracy increased. So we had a real problem with that. Next one, please. Now, we also had a little bit of problem with geography in this area. We have, kings drawing lines on maps, and sometimes they overlapped, and this could cause, a bit of difficulty. And as we know, Pennsylvania and Maryland were not always happy about the situation. Neither was Virginia. All our properties at points overlapped. Could I have the next one? It got even more convoluted as time went on, with overlapping jurisdictions and claims and problems. Next one, please. So, and one more. So I want to talk about one of our neighbors and part-time resident for a while, William Claiborne, a wealthy planter and trader, major figure in politics of Virginia, but he also owned properties on Kent Island, what is now Kent Island, and also up at the mouth of the Susquehanna. And he was probably the first legitimate instance of piracy occurred with regard to Claiborne. And of course, it's now Garrett Island. It was Palmer Island, where he had a trading post. Now, next one, please. Actually, so we're up at the top of the bay. There's Kent Island, and one more, please. There we are up at Garrett Island or Palmer Island. And he, in fact, Claiborne seized a vessel that belonged to the Calverts when it was in the area, because he felt they were intruding on his trading with the Susquehannock, and thereby committed the first piracy on the Chesapeake Bay. Now, if you're from Virginia, you might beg to differ, but we're in Maryland, and he's a pirate. Next one, please. So what then happened, of course, we have to have a little bit of quid pro quo. When he brought his vessels down to the western shore in 1635, his vessel was seized by the Calverts when he came to the western shore. So now we've got tit for tat a little bit. The next one, please. Now, this one doesn't do justice. Bill Wilson does a much better lecture, but just to let you know, this is on the Pocomoke Sound. We have an instance now where Claiborne's vessel, the Cockatrice, attacked Calvert's vessels, the St. Helen and the St. Margaret. He did lose, but this established the dubious honor of the first recorded naval battle in North America between Englishmen. So Kent Island, of course, wasn't formally ceded to Maryland until 1776. So we do have a little bit of trading. So we have mercantile interests causing some of this piracy, plus geographic differences of opinion. The next one, please. Now, if we want to go down to St. Mary's for a moment, and I'll just leave that one there. The other instance we have early on of piracy in this area was during the Civil War in Britain, when we had the interregnum, if you call it. A merchantman, Richard Ingle, he was a Protestant ship captain and a tobacco trader, frequently went to St. Mary's City, and when during the interregnum, he became a very staunch Puritan, and actually, because he had felt falsely accused of a crime that one of his men actually did not commit, he kind of went over the line for that reason, went back to St. Mary's and plundered up and down the Potomac for, it wasn't very long, it was only about, I'm trying to get the exact time, about a few months, but he did enough damage that I think it was about 14 weeks, but it became known as the Reign of Terror and the plundering time. So he was probably another one of our very few legitimate pirates. And that kind of brings out what motivates pirates. In his case, it was religion, politics, a sense of being self-aggrieved over this false accusation. So it's not always just outright greed. We do have a lot of, as I said, these petty pirates and thieves at sea who, if you wanted to really insult someone, you called them a picaroon. It comes from the Spanish, but it was used mostly by the British if you thought someone was a Tory sympathizer. And so and it was used on the Eastern Shore when people weren't happy with someone they thought was leaning the wrong way, and they became known as picaroons. So, and there were a few other pirates who were fairly well known, Roger McKeel, and who had very large crews, more so than the usual 2 or 3 people. But and there were a few other cases from down in Virginia that were quite amusing, but we had a little bit of a time constraint here, so I'll tease you with that, and you'll have to talk to me another time. I will stay after for questions, but I'd like to move on to a few other folks first and end up with some very interesting work that's going on right now. Next, please. One of the places we do have a few pirates that stay, and it's very small now, I couldn't find an old map, Watts Island in the southern Chesapeake. And a lot of the bigger named, if you want to call them that, if you have celebrity pirates, did come up to this area from the Caribbean. There was a time when several shiploads thought they were going to retire here and become farmers. It lasted until the next ship showed up and they said, no, we're done with this. We're back down. And I'm going to talk about 2 of them briefly, but first we need to talk a little bit about the Caribbean. Please. There's Watts Island. Okay, next one, please. All right. When someone talks to you about the Spanish Main, how many of you think they mean the water? I always did, the bounding main. No, it's the land. It means the mainland. When Spain conquered the New World, if you will, they weren't referring to the islands. The Spanish Main was the mainland. But originally they did land on the islands, but as soon as they found out there was mainland in there with possible gold, they moved, and what they did was, next please, they left all their cattle and pigs on the islands to run feral for a number of reasons. Same reasons they did on the barrier islands. You don't need a fence. And that's your last stop before you head across the ocean. Get your fresh meat, get your fresh water. And so they just let them run amok out there, which was, fine for everyone, except you started to get people who moved out there to live on them. And these folks, as I said, what motivates a pirate? Maybe it's greed. Some of these folks were adventurers. They might have been escaping politics or religion. Maybe they were escaping a criminal past, slavery. They might have been military deserters. Maybe they found their family life or gave them limited economic options. Just survivalists, adventurers. Well, these fellows moved out there and they started to hunt these animals. Next, please. And they would dry the meat and clean the hides and make a little business of selling them to passing ships. Well, the little grills and things that they would dry the meat on were called bouquets en français, in French. And so people who tended bouquets are boucaniers, who became the buccaneers. And these guys, in addition to trading hides, every now and then would want a little bit of money. They might actually take the ship and go a-pirating for a bit. Well, needless to say, Spain was not enamored of this idea, and so they said, well, we'll solve that. They went out and killed all the hogs and cattle and said, there. Well, now you've given them only one lifestyle, haven't you? They're not hunting anymore. Now they're full-time pirates. So, actually, I exaggerated a little bit. They weren't full-time pirates. A lot of them, during hurricane season, what happens? All the ships go home. So you're left out there, and you either have to move, and some of them did to Madagascar, another tale for another day, but other ones went to the Spanish Main, went to the mainland, and they, harvested logwood. Logwood was one of the few ways you could make a nice red or purple dye without going to cochineal or madder or anything. And they would harvest logwood, mostly illegally, it wasn't theirs, and sell that off. So they were a little bit of lumberjacking, and when the ships came back, they went back to piracy. Next one, please. It's still used, but not as much. We've got synthetic dyes now. It used to be used to stain laboratory slides. Next one. Yes, please. So, of course, what happened is these men were all, they couldn't stay. A few of them stayed on some of the islands. Some of them, if you remember your history, were invited by the British to move to Port Royal to help stave off other pirates who were living on Tortuga. And this caused all kinds of their own problems. But I won't go on into all of those. You can go to the next one. I took Port Royal out. All right, because we aren't going to talk about that today. But I did want to mention 2 particular pirates, because they did spend time in the Chesapeake, both of them. This fellow, William Dampier. If you've been to the British Museum, until 1994, the sign by his portrait said, circumnavigator and pirate. Now it says, he was sanitized about 94, and it now says circumnavigator and hydrographer explorer or something like this, as he's been tidied up for polite society. He was an amazing man. He came to the Caribbean as a clerk on a Jamaican plantation. He didn't like it. He did do a little logwooding, and he sort of took to the buccaneer life. But he was literate, and he wrote several books, most of which are available now. You can buy them in repro. And he was a wonderful cartographer. And he, of course, when you go back to polite society to write your books, you can't say I was a buccaneer. You'd be hung. So it was like, oh, I was forced into it. Nobody was ever really forced into being a pirate. Most of them joined voluntarily. The only people ever forced into it were if you were a navigator or a sea artist, because you were very valuable. And a few of the most famous pirates started out as kidnapped navigators who kind of took to the life. And that, again, a teetotaling, Bible-reading butcher who was the most successful pirate ever, Black Bart. But anyway, so Dampier actually did make 3 circumnavigations long before anyone else. And can we go on for a moment? He did draft the area. He lost his collections many times, but he managed to always save his maps. And he was an amazingly good cartographer. He did experiments for his friend Mr. Humboldt on currents and brought the information back. He studied the people. Another one, please. He met the Aborigines and charted the coasts of Australia. Keep going. And in fact, he was sent back there to keep charting it. He also went on one exploratory voyage. He was a terrible captain. Several times he captained vessels. He got court-martialed. He wasn't a very good captain. He was a great cartographer, wasn't meant to be in charge. The men hated him. He had to sleep with a gun under his pillow. A couple times he got left behind in places. Not of his own volition. He also ties in with Robinson Crusoe, but that's another day. Next one, please. But he had a clerk draft up these animals. He introduced all kinds of words to the English language, 30 or 40, including iguana, tattoo, barbecue, and a few others. You can see some of his maps, some of his drawings. They're not too bad. You can recognize an iguana, can't you? No, they're not too bad at all. Breadfruit, it was he who put it into Bligh's head about going to get breadfruit for the slave trade. Next ones, please. Some of the other maps and critters. He was on, I'll tell you a little bit, he was on the vessel that actually left Alexander Selkirk, i.e. Robinson Crusoe, behind, and he was on the ship 4 years later that picked him up. He wasn't in charge on the second one. He was with Woodes Rogers. So, brilliant man. He brought back, natives to visit North America. As I say, he wrote 3 books. He was on a vessel, the Roebuck, that ended up sinking off Ascension Island. It was virtually rotten. The University of Australia found it not too long ago and identified it by his exotic collections that were lost because they shouldn't have been there. So they were able to find out exactly where the Roebuck went down. So very interesting chap. He's worth a whole lecture on his own if you're ever in my classes. So William Dampier, anthropologist, hydrographer. His maps were the ones that Captain Cook used when he went on his famous voyages. And those of you in the Navy, into World War II, the American Navy used Captain Cook's maps. So they were really using this Buccaneers maps from back in the 17th century until they were properly recharted during World War II. All right, next one, please. I don't have a portrait of our next person. Lionel Wafer, or Dilla Wafer, he used sometimes. He was a surgeon, so another literate person who kept records and who wrote books. He was injured while they were crossing the Darien, which is actually part of Panama, the Panama Strip, and left behind because he couldn't keep up with 3 or 4 other men. They figured they would be killed by the Kuna Indians, not the ones who live on the San Blas archipelago, if you've been there. This are where the Embera people are now. But he was left behind. They thought he'd be a goner. Well, he actually made nice with them and stayed with them for several months. Next one, please. And drew pictures, kept records. He became the anthropologist surgeon pirate. And kind of went native. When he went back, he finally made a deal with the Chief de Leve to go get him some hunting dogs. The chief loved European hunting dogs. And he went back, and he actually got onto his own ship with the long beard and the local clothes, and his own men didn't know them until someone twigged he had blue eyes and recognized who he was. And he did come back. They were both up at different times. They were old chums. They knew each other. And they actually met up on Watts Island, and it was Dampier was there to settle down when De La Wafer showed up and talked him into coming back to the life down in the Caribbean. So they went back to sea. Then Wafer decided he was going to retire, and he went to Philadelphia, had forged papers, came through Philadelphia, tried to get legitimized, came down Maryland, was heading for Lynnhaven Bay with two other fellows who were rather well known, and a slave. And they were picked up and had far too much Spanish coin on them to be not suspect. And they all had very consistent story until the slave outed them. Now, let's see, you got to be nice to your people. He wasn't, they said, nope, they turned them in, and they said they were arrested there. They spent several years in jail in Jamestown. And instead of being, they had a good lawyer. It was a clergyman who kept arguing, so they weren't hung. And they finally were sent to Europe to prison in England. And they managed, one of the very few pirates who managed to buy their way out of jail. They turned over their loot, most of it. They got to keep a little bit, strangely enough. Very good clergyman for an attorney. And they were released with the provision that they give the money to the colonies for the founding of an institute of higher learning. We have the next one, please. And the interesting thing was, one more, please. I used to talk about this, and I would get Daughters of the Confederacy so mad at me. They were denying this. How dare you say that William and Mary was founded by pirates? Now it's on their website. We think that one or two of the buildings that founded William and Mary were the ones funded by Wafer's ill-gotten gains. Sadly, in both their cases, in their journals, neither of them discuss the area. Dampier says, thought to settle down, but, decided against it. We figure he got into trouble somewhere. Wafer just said, thought to settle down in Virginia, but it didn't work out. Really wanted to know all about their court case and what happened, but of course that would have been admitting piracy, so they sort of left that out of their journals, the part I wanted most. So, bit of a disappointment there. Next one, please. Just as a passing remark, of course, piracy was rampant on the north coast, or rather, I have to talk about privateers here, on the north coast of Africa, the Barbary coast, and of course the infant United States was no longer protected by the British Navy and had to go over and defend any of its merchants in the area, and so was involved several times in battling the Barbary Corsairs. Corsairs means cruisers. They were actually privateers for the Muslim Sultanate. And there were pirates on the other side too. The Knights of Malta were not saints. They were out, anyone they caught, they sold into slavery in Italy. So, Knights of Malta were not what you would think. But in any case, during these adventures of the fledgling American Navy, because Jefferson would not pay tribute, he sent the Navy over. A number of individuals, Stephen Decatur's brother in one case, was actually killed. And for the 6 officers who died, the men took up a collection and created the first, we have the next one, created the first military monument for the United States. Keep going, please. And it was the Decatur and the burning of the Philadelphia in 1803. Next one, please. They developed the Tripoli Monument. It stood in Washington for a number of years. It's around 1806-07. It's now on the grounds of the Naval Academy and been recently restored. But it's got wonderful little Saracens' heads and pirates and crossed cannons and bagpipes, which are, of course, a Turkish invention. Sorry, Scotsman. Sorry, Secretary Craig. They did come from there. But we do have this wonderful monument that deals with, dealing with the piracy or Corsairs off North Africa. They managed to put down piracy in that area by about 1830. But coming back to North America, please. Oh, Tripoli, one more. We want to talk about privateering. What is a privateer? Basically a legal pirate, if you're the person carrying the letter of marque. If you're the person on the boat who receives their attentions, you just think they're pirates. It really doesn't matter. You're losing your boat. It doesn't matter if they have paper or not. Privateers could carry a letter of reprisal, a letter of marque, or a letter of marque and reprisal. That's what you really wanted. Reprisal meant you had been wrongly done by an enemy or an enemy's pirate or privateer. You could go back and seek vengeance up to the amount you lost. Now, who keeps track of that? I think people achieved that goal several times over. I would not admit it. A letter of marque meant you were like freelance Navy. You had a right to go out and capture anything you could that would harm your enemy's economy. But you had to bring it back, turn it into a claims court. The person who sponsored you, the government, if you weren't the owner of your ship, plus it would take their cut. Then you got yours to divvy with your men. So how much of it got divvied before it made it to prize court? That's up for debate. There's a lot of discussion on that. So young countries that couldn't afford a navy, poor countries that couldn't afford a navy, those are the people who hired privateers. So you can imagine during the American Revolution, places like Salem, Boston, and Newport, Rhode Island. You can go on, just show a few of the ports. And Philadelphia were havens for privateers during the Revolutionary War. Baltimore had a few, but not as many at this time. Coming into our own in the War of 1812, of course, was Baltimore. One more, that's Crown and Shield. Here we are, Baltimore. And Baltimore, Salem, and Boston, of course. I think the Boston brig Yankee took the record with 40 prizes totaling over $3 million. So privateers were very much useful in the Revolution, or in the War of 1812. Next one, please. Now, and one more. Here we are. That was Charleston. Charleston also came into its own during the War of 1812. I've got Commodore Barney here, and we all know and love Joshua Barney as our war hero of 1812. He actually was a bigger war hero of the Rev War. Started out as a privateer on his vessel Rossi, and was so effective that he ended up being taken into the regular Navy. Then he retired and came out of retirement to become the honorary Commodore Barney for the War of 1812. But I've only included him as the Rev War representative because he started as a privateer then and sort of made his name and his competency. And later on, he was more legit Navy by the time he was in the end of that war in the beginning of 1812. Next one, please. But you can see how effective privateers were during the War of 1812. Much more effective than Navy, and because they have an incentive. I mean, they make huge profits. And of course, the economic damage they do the enemy, they pay for themselves, and they potentially contribute to the government's funds. You know, who doesn't love that? So it was perfect for a situation with a young country and a war effort. Next one, please. Our biggest claim to fame, Maryland's biggest claim to fame during the War of 1812 was Thomas Boyle, out of Baltimore, out of Fells Point, one of the most successful privateers, first captained the Comet, built in Fells Point, then the Chasseur. And the Chasseur, of course, if you know the Pride of Baltimore, the Chasseur is the model on which the Pride was built. So the Pride of Baltimore we have now looks like the Chasseur. Very successful vessel. Very successful cruises. He took many, many vessels. And take a look at the vessel lines. I'll show it again in a moment. But can we go on to another one? We have very few photographs of the period. One more, please. But we do have this gentleman who was actually, this is George Roberts, who was a free black gunner who served with Boyle. So one of our few known African-American privateers. Very successful, although he doesn't look it so much there. That's in old age. He did very well during the war and distinguished himself extensively. Now, privateers, after the end of the war, it goes right back to like pirates. You have a choice. Your letter of marque is no good anymore. So you either have to go back to being a legitimate merchant or turn pirate. What do you want? You've made a huge amount of money. What do you want to do? What a lot of them did was went down to Central and South America, changed the name of their ship to something Hispanic sounding, and became a privateer for one of the Spanish colonies that was now fighting for its independence. Because the wars go on. We may have ended ours. War of 1812, done in 1815. 1816, 17, 18, a lot of Baltimore privateers went south. But the problem was that was still illegal in the States. So our documentation is scant on this. More and more is coming to light, but trying to find information is pretty dicey because they weren't supposed to be doing that. All right, next one, please. And the reason I'm telling you this is very recently, a multi-agency project in the Gulf of Mexico, Shell Oil sent in was looking for new gas and oil leases, sent in some archaeological survey and said, we found these blips. NOAA went down with a number of other agencies, mostly privately funded out of Texas, and we found one of these blips has turned out to be this very impressive looking vessel. This is a Mosaic made. It's in 4,000 feet of water. Nobody's dived into this baby. And if we can have the next one, please. In the center of it is a pivot gun and 2 carronades. This is exactly what the privateers out of Baltimore used, and it was one of the Navy's complaints. You couldn't put bow chasers because it was so sharp it couldn't take the weight. You couldn't put stern chasers because they were so sharp they couldn't take the weight. It's why they were so fast. The Navy didn't want them. You could only put 5 months provisions in the bow, no room. Privateers didn't care. They didn't want to sink other ships. They just wanted them to surrender. Then you take their food and you use them as prizes and you store your stuff there. So they didn't care if they didn't have these things. This boat, can I have the next one, please? So it's a little bit hard to see, but this is what the pivot guns look like. And this matches exactly what's coming out of Baltimore. Next one, please. This is what our ROV taking pictures coming down on the anchors. I'm trying desperately to find photos. We're going back. We're doing all of this remotely. The boat holds 13 people. There are 60 scientists. So we're all sitting in Bob Ballard's command center or the NOAA command center in Silver Spring with headsets going a little to the left, you know. And there's tons of pictures on this, but we don't have time. I'm teasing you with this because there's more to come. Next one, please. We do think it looks a lot like the Pride. We're looking out off the bow where all of the hardware has fallen. It had an extremely long boom and jib boom. We're looking at how sharp. That's the bow down in the bottom. Stern section is just as sharp, copper clad. And the really cool thing, I don't know if there's another one. Go one more and see if there's some of the things we're finding on it. We actually found some of the china that's identifiable. We found Spanish ceramics. We know they were landing in the Yucatan area. These are very distinctive. The next one, please. We found books. We think we see a book down there. We're trying to figure out how we can get it up in one piece. The next one. This was cool. We found the medical center, and this is a jar of ginger. Seasickness, they still used it back then. We found 2 or 3 intact jars, and this sucker picked it up, and it's shaking, and we're all, it was like Nassau. When they got that into the box, the place erupted, and they brought it up and opened it, and it still smells like ginger. So it's amazing stuff that's coming off this wreck. But the cool part was we didn't have permits, so we could only look but not touch. 2 more vessels nearby. One was a full ship carrying rolls of hide and boxes of tallow. The hide and tallow trade, if you've read 2 Years Before the Mast, that was West Coast. It's still happening on the East Coast in Mexico. And the other vessel, there was another copper-clad one, and on all 3 we saw the navigation gear. That means nobody got off. They would have taken that if they'd gotten into vessels and escaped. We don't know what was on the other copper-clad one. There are no guns. And if they were on the surface, all 3 would be within sight of each other. Did this privateer capture 2 ships? They were heading toward Galveston. We know who was hanging out there, right? Jean Lafitte? We're hoping. This is all speculation, but it's a great story. So was this an escort for these vessels, or was it a capture? We don't know, but they would have maybe been together. We found some coins, 1818. So we know it couldn't have sunk before that. There was a big hurricane in 1818, lost a lot of vessels. Maybe these all went down in the same instance. They could not be related. It might be that they're not related at all either, but this is, we're very interested in exploring this further. So there's more to come on this one. I just give you a little tease. Last year we did mostly biological studies because we haven't done enough analysis to move forward. I'm in charge with Jim Delgado, who is on our board, the Maryland Historical Trust Board. We're looking at the hull structure now, but it's looking more and more like a Baltimore-built vessel. Can we identify it? No, if it was lost, it never reported in, but they were doing this illegally, so is there a record somewhere? We're not sure, so we're still looking. And I'll end there because I know we're out of time. If you want to know more about any of this, I'm happy to stay around and answer questions. Thank you. Go for it. I know time's short, so.
Thank you, Dr. Langley. I'm going to ask Lisa to sign off for us, please.
Thank you so very, very much for coming and attending and joining us today. It means a lot that you're here. Stay in touch with us through the year. I'm always available, and let me know if I can help you. Be sure and look at our mini grant projects on the way out, and thanks a lot. Drive safe.